Thank you, John. Excellencies, Reverend Fathers, Holy Religious, and fellow faithful, I want to express my gratitude to Father Gruner for having invited me to participate in this conference. I regret that my duties at the university prevented me from sharing the entire week with you, but I'm grateful to at least to have been able to be here the past few days. I also, before beginning, want to publicly thank and acknowledge Father Gruner's incredible, in fact, supernatural fortitude and perseverance all these years for remaining faithful to his mission to make known the message of Fatima. And Father has done this notwithstanding so many attacks against what he's doing. We've already talked a little bit this week, and you're aware of the calumnies of the, as Christopher Ferrara called them, the loony left against Father. And it just amazes me. I'd really like to ask anyone who's ever met Father Gruner if you could even conceive of Father bearing hatred or an attitude of hatred towards anyone. He's probably I can't think of another person I know who is least likely to hate anyone than Father Gruner, and yet that's what they make up. Another attack against Father that I want to talk about a little bit because it may raise the question, why are we talking about this issue? Why are we talking about the UN? Why are we talking about the economy? All these things. And it's an interesting attack. It doesn't come from the loony left. It often comes from conservative Catholics. Well, if only she can help you, and the only thing that can solve this is the consecration of Russia, why are you having a week-long conference? Just say, consecrate Russia, let's go home. Only she can help us. And they take a truth and they distort it. Because that is not what Our Lady wants. She didn't come to the shepherd children and say, only I can help you. Okay, go away. What does she do? And she says, no. Number one, I want you to know what's going on. She reveals to them why Russia needs to be consecrated. So the first point, the reason for this conference, is we need to understand the depth of the problem that only she can solve. Why? So that, number one, we're motivated, as his Father Gruner, to persevere in praying and sacrificing for the consecration of Russia. Because, as William Jasper showed, if we don't realize there's a problem, if we think everything's fine, we're not going to work for it. So the first important point of this conference is to recognize the great depth and breadth of the problem. The second purpose, though, is Our Lady does tell us a period of peace will be given to the world, a time to rebuild. And our second purpose in discussing these issues is to preserve the truths about the way God wants his world, the world he rules, to be run. And so we don't do this because we think tomorrow we can elect somebody to Congress and we're going to fix it all. It's beyond us. Only she can help us. But there will come a day when Russia is consecrated, when the beast is stomped out, and we need to rebuild. And if we've lost all the knowledge of Christian centuries on the way these things are supposed to work, we won't have the tools to rebuild with God's help. So they're really the two purposes in my talk and many of the others you've heard on the depth of the problem. It's not to scare people and make people depressed. It's to, A, remember what we're fighting against and why we're making sacrifices, and B, to preserve the knowledge of the truth. And so we're going to talk today about usury and about the truth, about what the church has and always has taught, and about the great injustice that it perpetrates. We're going to summarize the argument. I've recently published a book, The Church and the Usurers, which goes into much more detail than we can talk about today. And I'm going to try to summarize the arguments for you. If you are interested, I have a few copies that I was able to bring with me that the Remnant is selling, if you'd like to explore the topic a little longer. Ron Paul, the other day, made an important distinction. He said, there's a distinction between crimes and sin. And in that, he's correct. I think Catholics would disagree at where he draws the line, but he's correct. And so I want to make clear the purpose in the talk is to make you understand and help you to come to see that usury is a sin. And it's a very particular type of sin, a sin against justice. And that's important because many people, many Catholics of very good will, don't accept that anymore. And they do for either two reasons. They say either the church was wrong for thousands of years when she said it was a sin, she didn't know what she was talking about. You see the obvious problems with that line, but that's what some well-intentioned Catholics say. Or the church changed. So usury was wrong, but now the church says it's okay. That's the modernist era, that what was wrong can become right. And so it's very important to understand that usury is a sin of injustice because of these attacks, sadly, by Catholics, by both liberal, what the modern world would call liberal, and conservative. But secondly, what's important, and that's mostly what we're going to talk about today, but what is important is, although Dr. Paul is right, there's a distinction. The line is not at just physical aggression. Crimes are not just people beating you up. They are sins, injustices, which affect the common good of society. And the civil authority has the obligation to regulate and control that. Not, as St. Thomas says, by making criminal every sin. That's not only impossible, but imprudent. Think of just theft, for example. Right? The civil authority does not put in jail your child when he steals some cookies from the pantry. That's still a sin of theft. But it doesn't touch the common good yet. And so the distinction isn't just between physical harm, it's between injustices, which affect all of us, injustice in society. And now, how you draw that line, which sins become criminal in what way, is an issue of political prudence. Not going to get into that very much today. The principle is the government has a role to intervene, not to micromanage or centrally plan the economy, but to intervene to prevent and correct injustice. And that's been the role of government since time immemorial. We're not going to get, though, into the details of exactly how this government in this particular time should do it. That's a different discussion. What's important is to see that need and to see, as I said, that it is injustice. William Jasper did an excellent job showing us that the way communism is triumphing is by convincing us that it doesn't exist. Well, one of the weapons it's using is usurious lending. Why? What is the aim of communism? To confiscate rich in the hands of the few, the dictators of the proletariat, and have everybody equal in their poverty. Now, they can do that through military conquest. They tried that. Or they can do it through injustice, economic injustice, wage and economic war, and sap all of the wealth from everyone to the few. And so, in many ways, this conference sinks in with what Mr. Jasper was telling us. We've been deceived. We're being told everything's fine, everything's great, when meanwhile there's an economic war going on. And so I'd like to begin, considering this and where we've been and where we are now, by reading you a quote. I'm not going to tell you who it's from at first, or when it was written. Can we suppose, and he's speaking about usury, can we suppose the principle of moral restraint of such uniform and universal adoption has no good sense in it? Is it altogether the result of monkish prejudice? Ought we not rather to conclude that the provision is adapted to the necessities and the wants of our species and grows out of the natural infirmity of man and the temptation to abuse inherent in pecuniary loans? Is it an idle dream to suppose that we are wiser and better than the rest of mankind? Such doctrine may be taught by those who find it convenient to flatter popular prejudice. But the records of our courts are daily teaching us a lesson of more humility. That quote is from 1819, and it is not from a pope. It is not even from a Catholic. It is from the highest court in the state of New York, not by a Catholic judge. So how have we gone from 200 years ago, almost, where a non-Catholic civil secular court could see the obviousness of the crime and sin of usury, to a time when good conservative, quote-unquote, Catholics say exactly what he said. We're better than our ancestors. There's nothing wrong with this. This is just business. Well, it's from a loss of a sense of understanding the doctrine of the church, a doctrine which was known since the ancient world. Now, before touching on that, I just want to summarize a little bit the extent of the problem and give you a few facts and figures about where we've come from 1819 to today, and specifically the past 30 years before the great financial collapse brought on by usurious lending in 2008. With the passage of time, a new philosophy evolved regarding consumer credit. No longer was borrowing a stigma, a sign of poverty or financial mismanagement. Rather, borrowing became the American way to instantly raise one's standard of living. Indeed, it became desirable economic policy to encourage consumer credit and thereby accelerate the movement of goods and services through the market. Consumers accepted their duty to borrow with enthusiasm, and the availability of credit exploded. In 1976, total household debt outstanding was $818.9 billion. By 2006, the eve of the crisis, it had grown to $12.816 trillion. These outstanding total debt figures comprise $517 billion of mortgage debt, $229 billion of consumer debt in 1976, $9.676 trillion and $2.438 trillion, respectively, in 2006. In 76, U.S. households borrowed $83 billion. By 2006, that 1 year alone, they borrowed a staggering $1.012 trillion. When business, government, financial sector, foreign debt are included, total borrowings rose from $244 billion to $2.1 trillion. Now, these numbers, it's almost like the numbers Mr. Jasper showed us on the horrible genocide. They're just so incomprehensible, we can't even think about them. They're so staggering. In this same 30-year period, debt growth outpaced growth domestic product, GDP, where our economy grew by 6.3% and total borrowings grew by 8.6%. Doesn't take a huge mathematician to say if your income grows by 6%, but you borrow 8%, you're borrowing more than you can sustain. The growth of the credit markets can also be seen in the proliferation of new usurious lenders. Payday lending, for instance, was unheard of 30 years before the financial crisis. But by 2005, there were over 20,000 payday lenders in retail, and that number, 20,000, outnumbers McDonald's, Burger King, Sears, JCPenney, and Target stores combined. Debt has become the largest national product we sell. Now, what's interesting is Professor Peterson and Graves wrote an article a few years ago studying an interesting phenomenon. They made a map of the United States and showed the location geographically of the so-called religious right. By their definition, people who support politically and social conservative issues, like opposition to legalized abortion, same-sex marriage, et cetera. And they mapped that population. They then overlaid the location of new payday lenders and other outrageously charged credit that's charged at outrageous rates. They overlapped almost identically. And they just raised the question, they said, how is it that people who obviously are very sincere about the Bible and very sincere about the Word of God on these other crimes allow in their own backyard an evil condemned with more frequency than those other sins we've just discussed in the Bible? The answer is, like many truths of moral and theological significance, it's just been buried. People have been told, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't exist. In 1965, Professor Peterson says, every state in the nation had a usury limit on consumer laws. Today, 9 states have completely deregulated rates within their borders. In 1965, banks were actually required to comply with the law, surprising as that may be. Today, banks are free, regardless of whatever state law says, to charge whatever they want. They are exempted from the law. They are lawless within even these loose limits that now remain. They are only subject to safety and soundness regulation by prudential regulators. In 1965, no state explicitly or implicitly allowed for prices on loans above 300% per annum. Today, 36 states have laws allowing lenders to charge over 300%. In 1965, usury laws were drafted with rigidity, so much so that 45 states did not allow any rates over 60%. Today, the number of states accomplishing this has fallen to 7. And remember, even in those 7, it doesn't apply to the people who make the loans, the banks. They're exempt. That exemption, and this is something I think Dr. Paul would be very interested in, was not accomplished by Democratic representatives, by people voting. It was accomplished by an illegal and unjustified exertion of federal power. The Supreme Court, the Congress of the United States, and federal bureaucracies got together and just erased state law. Said, nope, it's gone, in the name of democratic freedom. An interesting story I tell in chapter 7 of the book. So much so that Congress actually passed a statute trumping, overruling the state constitution of Arkansas, which had only been passed a few years before, enshrining usury regulation in its state constitution. Null and void, in the name of democracy. Now, how did we get there? Well, what we seemed not able to understand was obvious to many in the ancient world 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. They discovered it through two sources, the two sources by which we come to know truth, the use of our reason through the natural law and through divine law. So the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who knew no revelation, saw that charging usury was an injustice. Yet, those who had revelation, God provided through the divine law clear teaching, so that if you couldn't figure it out, as many did, and by the way, the capital of usurious lending, this follows up on the last talk, was Babylon, highest rates in the ancient world. But he tells us in the Bible, and I document page after page in the book, quotations from the scriptures, condemning usury in the most severe terms, and usually linked with the gravity of another sin against nature that we should not speak about. And in fact, equating the two, because they are not just sins, but they are sins against the natural order, directly compared, the sin for which Sodom and Gomorrah fell and usury. That's the seriousness that the Bible and Revelation treats the crime of usury. In the Christian era, our Lord confirmed the Old Testament condemnation in Luke 6:35, lend hoping for no profit thereby. The first ecumenical council of the church after the era of persecution, 325, the Council of Nicaea, most famous for its condemnation of the Arian heresy. But it did other things we often forget about because that is of such theological importance. But it, for the first time, enacted laws for the church because now the church was freed from persecution and could establish order. The first criminal law enacted by the Council of Nicaea was to criminalize usury within the church. That's how important it is. From the very beginning of the church freely exercising her power, that's the first sin she turns to. Now, so what is usury? Again, we're talking a lot about it and the sources, but what does it actually mean? Because as with all moral teaching, the perversions of what the church says are widespread. The church condemns it as an injustice, but carefully defines it. Right? Just like the church condemns murder, but then carefully explains and defines what murder is. The death of a soldier in a just war is not immoral murder. The self-defense, where proportional measures are used, is not murder. Does that mean that the church says murder is fine? No. Condemns it in no uncertain terms, but is careful to explain. Doesn't say we just indiscriminately call everything what it's not, and carefully defines it. So, I'd like to read to you from a 5th century law of the church that's collected in Gratian's Decretum, explaining the sin of usury. Of all merchants, the most cursed is the usurer, for he sells a good given by God, not acquired, as a merchant acquires his goods from men. And after the usury, he reseeks his own good, taking back his own good and the good of the other. A merchant, however, does not reseek the good that he has sold. One will object, is not he who rents a field to receive the fruits of a house to get an income similar to him who lends his money at usury? Certainly not. First, because money is only meant to be used in purchasing. Secondly, because one having a field by farming receives fruit from it. One having a house has the use of inhabiting it. So therefore, he who rents a field or a house is seen to give what is his own use and to receive money. And in a certain manner, it seems as if he exchanged gain for gain. But from money, which is stored up, you can take no use. Thirdly, a field or house deteriorates in use. Money, however, which is lent and returned, is neither diminished nor deteriorated. Now, that's a lot for us to digest since we're so far from it. So let me explain what this Catholic document is saying. And this is based heavily on the explanations of St. Thomas. Money, and this applies to any other fungible consumable, is something that you can only use if you own it. Your use and ownership are combined. So you can't separately sell the use and the ownership. Okay? Unlike a house, take this example. I can own a house and continue to own it, but sell its use, rent it. Because you don't need to consume the house to live in it. You live in it for a time, right? Use it, it's not destroyed. It's not consumed. And instead of money, we take another example that St. Thomas uses to help understand the difference. Wine. Right? A bottle of wine. You take it. When you use it, it's gone. Because the only use for a bottle of wine is to drink it. Right? Once you've drunk it, it's gone. It's been consumed in its use. And when he says you sell the same thing twice, if I sell you a bottle of wine, say $30, then I say, now I'm going to charge you to drink it. Say, what are you talking about? I own the wine, I drink it. If I say, well, here, you can have this bottle of wine, I'm going to charge you to drink it, but I'm going to own it. Well, what do you own? It gets consumed in use. It's a thing where it can't separate these two because it's meant to be consumed. Same thing with money. You can't eat money. You can't sleep with it. You can't keep warm with it. You can't clothe yourself with it. You have to use it. It's used and consumed in use. It goes out of your possession. So what the teaching was is you can't charge, if you charge a profit, and this is what's meant by a profit. Let's go back to the wine example. So you're having a party at your house, and you forgot to get some wine. So you come over and you say, oh, I know you have some wine in your wine cellar. I've got a big party tonight. We live in a state like Oklahoma with all these laws, and it's impossible to buy them today because they're not Catholic, so they try to stop any sale of wine. Could you lend me some? Now, when you say, could you lend me some, he is not planning to return the wine. I would not want it after he drinks it, right? He's saying, give me your bottle of wine. Let's say it's a Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon of a particular year. I'm going to use it and drink it at my party, and I'll get a different bottle of the same year, the same quality, and give it back to you. Not the exact same wine, but a comparable one of the same value. And again, if I said, sure, you can have it, but you can't drink it, he said, well, I don't want it. Or, now, here's the catch. I say to him, yes, give me back the wine, plus $50, because I want to charge you for drinking the wine I just gave you. That's the injustice of usury, because when I give you ownership of the wine, what that must mean is the ability to use it. So if I then charge you to use what you already own, I'm charging you for something I don't possess. When we lend money, even our legal system today says, you own it. If you borrow money, I can't go back and say, you have my money. Under the tax law and everything else, it's your money to use and consume. So if I charge you once, I'm going to give you the bottle of wine in exchange for an equal bottle of wine. That's my charge. And it's an equal exchange, a fair exchange, one bottle for one bottle. But then say, I'm going to charge you more on top of it, I'm selling something that doesn't belong to me, the use value of it. Hence the term usury. And that's why it's an injustice. I am extracting more than I give you. Same thing with money. Again, it's a little easier, I think, to understand with wine. But if I have a gold coin, I'm not doing anything with it. I give it to you. You give a gold coin, not the same one, because why would you borrow it to give back to me? You're borrowing it to spend it, to use it for some purpose. Give it back to me. I say, now I want 2 gold coins. I've gotten back what I gave you. We've had an equal exchange. I'm demanding something more. There's a few distinctions we'll get to, but that's the general principle. St. Thomas, as I said in the Summa Theologica, summarizes this. To quote a part, he says, to take usury for money lent is unjust in itself, because this is to sell what does not exist. And this evidently leads to inequity, which is contrary to justice. In order to make this evident, we must observe that there are certain things, the use of which consists in their consumption. Thus we consume wine when we use it for drink, and we consume wheat when we use it for food. Wherefore, in such like things, the use of the thing must not be reckoned apart from the thing itself. And whoever is granted the use of the thing is granted the thing himself. And for this reason, to lend things of this kind and require their return, to transfer the ownership. Accordingly, if a man wanted to sell wine separately from the right to drink the wine he just sold, he would be selling the same thing twice, or he would be selling what does not exist. Wherefore, he would evidently commit a sin of injustice. Again, that's St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, some people object, and St. Thomas, I won't read it, covers this and says, but if you lend money, money makes money, so it's not the same thing. He says, no, this isn't true. Money does not make money. People generate wealth by doing something. They may use money as a tool, but that's all it is. If I take a pile of money and sit it here, it is not like rabbits. When I come back tomorrow, there's not going to be more. A person does something with it to generate wealth. And so it is not the lending of the money, it is not the money which generates new wealth, it's whatever people do with it. We'll talk in a minute about if I work with you to generate wealth, I have a right to share in what we create. But it's not the money that makes the wealth. It's whatever we're doing with it. That's another lie of modern finance. And it's much part of the perversion of the American dream. You can sit home on your couch and do nothing and get rich and let money make money for you. It can't. Somebody's doing something with that money. So, to summarize, the three traditional Catholic arguments, and again, not even Catholic, they go back to pagan philosophers who saw this truth through the natural law, can be summarized is money is not a productive asset. Money is a fixed medium of exchange. It's merely a tool for exchanging other things that actually have value in and of themselves. Can only be sold for its fixed value, its price, what it is. The ownership of money means nothing more than the right to use the money, to buy things, so one cannot charge separately for the use and the ownership. Now, I said to you before, all Catholic moral principles revolve around stating clear moral truths, something is wrong, but then drawing important distinctions. So we want to talk about those important distinctions. An error of many is to say, the church changed her teaching. Said, again, usury was wrong, now it's right. When all the church was doing was more properly defining, this isn't usury. Just like if I say to you, defending yourself in self-defense, using all proportional measures to protect yourself, isn't murder. I'm not saying murder is good. I'm saying what you did is not murder. Therefore, you can't say it's wrong because it's murder. And so what the church did for hundreds and hundreds of years, as situations changed, explained, this new activity, is that or is that not usury? When new medical procedures, I use medical loosely, were developed in the 20th century, people said, wait, is that murdering someone? These pills, these surgeries? And the church defined and said, well, yes, it is. That's murdering an unborn child. The church was not changing any teaching, but this particular pill didn't exist before. It came about. Now the church had to decide, is it or is it not? Other things arise, some medical technology that helps keep someone alive. Now, maybe it has the effect of weakening a system. So it's keeping them alive, but it's hurting them in some way. Church looks at it, no, that's not murdering them. You are doing a positive good that's keeping them alive, even though they may suffer some pain, let's say, for example. So church is about drawing distinctions on the facts. What constitutes this activity or not? Again, something a lot of people forget as a principle. So let's look at two important distinctions the church has always made. Number one, what does usury say? We've said it is charging a profit above what you're entitled to in justice. So if I lend you a bottle of wine and you say, okay, a bottle of wine, and all I have to give you back is a cup of juice. I say, well, that doesn't really seem fair. Much as I do have an obligation not to charge you an injustice, you have an obligation in justice, if I lend you a bottle of wine, to give me back an equivalent value. Which means the point of usury is not, as many people mistakenly say, the charging of interest on a loan. Huge confusion. usury, and there's a 16th century English case in the Chancery that has an interesting quote. It says, interest and usury are as different as falsehood is to truth, but the two have been conflated in a deceptive way to confuse us. So let me explain the difference. Usury is charging an injustice above and beyond what I'm entitled to in the equal exchange. So I will lend you the bottle of wine plus pay me $1,000 and give me back the bottle of wine. On the other hand, I'm not required to suffer a loss by lending something to you that you're going to return. So I don't have to. I'm free to give you the wine as a gift. We're all free to give a gift. But in justice, we don't have to give a gift. It's an act of charity. We're obligated to charity in the general sense we need to be charitable. But in any particular transaction, we can give a gift or we can have an exchange. So I'm not required by justice to take a loss. So now let's transfer that to money. If I go back to a simpler time when money actually meant something, when it really had a consistent value, which is, we talked a little bit in the last lecture, it doesn't now. We had a gold coin. So you say, I need to borrow a gold coin. I say, I'll lend it to you. In justice, give me back a gold coin of equal weight. So I lend you a gold coin of 3 ounces. You can't give me back a ½ ounce coin. That's unjust to me. 1 coin for 1 coin. But then on the other hand, what if I say, I'll lend it to you, but here's the problem. It's in my castle 200 miles away. I have to go send somebody to go pick it up. That will cost me some expense. The church said, you can ask the person to and require them, if you want me to lend it, please reimburse me for my loss, my expense to go get the coins to lend to you. That was interest. Comes from the Latin word, which means the difference. It was the Latin word for compensation for loss. So if someone came up and beat you up and hurt you, they had to pay you compensation, called a tort, for harming you. They had to pay the difference, what they did to harm you, they had to make up for it. That's what interest means, payment for loss. And so the church has said, if you have expenses that are legitimate, you're allowed to ask the person to reimburse you for those. But at the end of the day, you're exactly where you were before. You spent some money, you got your expenses back, you loaned your coins, you got your coins back. That's interest, it's not usury. Now, what happens? The world of deception today makes all of this very difficult. Because what did they do? They destroyed money. So now we know no longer does money represent the same thing. A gold coin in 1300 and 1350 and 1400 pretty much represented the same thing. The prices of goods or particular goods might change, but the money retained its value. We don't have that now. The last presentation showed that, right? The statistics. The 8 cents is all a dollar's worth now. So what do we know now? If I lend you $1 today, a dollar bill, and you give it back to me in 10 years, I've suffered a loss because our government, in collusion with the banks, has messed up money. It's like a medium of exchange is supposed to be a measure, a way to measure the value of goods. But what our money's become is like measuring a room with a meter stick that changes its size every few minutes. So you start measuring, and now your stick's a different size. Our money has become worthless as a measure of exchange. And so we know it's always actually changing in one direction, is getting less valuable. And so the church has understood that if I'm merely asking you, nominally it's called $1, but right now it's only worth 8 cents from the time I loaned it to you, you have to return to me nominally $1 plus 92 cents so that I'm made whole again. Now, that's a simple principle to understand, but because of all the smoke and mirrors in front of our monetary system for the purpose of deceiving us, it's hard to know exactly what that is. CPI figure, all these figures are fixed and rigged. So I admit, on the practical level, it's very difficult to work out exactly what is interest, but the principle is still the same. If I am charging you more than I suffer as a loss, I'm charging you usury, a gain. If I'm merely reimbursing cost, that's what I'm doing. Now, there's another distinction. It's in the book, and I don't have time to talk about it, but the church did recognize if some of the loss I suffer is I'm a merchant and I'm in business, but I'm going to lend you some money, and that will hurt my business. I will lose, certainly I know I will lose some profit as a result, because I don't have the tools in my business for a period of time. I can charge you for that loss I suffer. Again, popes were very careful. They said, but we know a lot of shifty people out there are going to try to exploit this and say, oh, I was going to make millions of dollars in my business, and so you have to reimburse me, and they're really covering up that they're charging a profit on the loan. So great caution with this, that we can't abuse it, but said, look, legitimately, if you can show with reasonable certainty Because you removed that tool that you were going to use to buy wool, to bring to a market, to make into clothing, to sell, and you couldn't do that, you could ask the borrower to compensate you for that loss. The test the popes always gave, though, is if you'd rather lend your money out and happier about that economically than going into your business, pretty good sign you knew you were making a profit, not covering a loss. So first distinction, interest is not usury. Again, it's a lot of people argue, oh, the church changed her position. She said interest was bad and now good. Wrong. Church has always said interest is permitted if it's really interest and not usury. Second distinction, people who participate in a business together to make a profit have a right to share the profits in a fair manner between them. And so if I'm not lending you money, but I'm saying, look, we both have some tools. You have some tools, I have some tools. Let's put them together and make a business to make a profit and then share the profit. That is not a loan. So I'm not saying I'm going to lend you money, go do whatever you want, and give me my money back. So we're going to invest our money. What's this distinguishing characteristic? Risk. I'm taking a business risk. Our business might not make money. I don't have the right to get back my bottle of wine, necessarily, if the business fails. If it works, I get it back and we share our profit. If not, that's not a loan. That's a business partnership. And the church, for centuries, St. Thomas Aquinas, all the way back, said, that's not a loan. So it's not saying usury is okay in that context. It's saying, that's not usury. That's something different. Now, unfortunately, not everything, our modern legal system and financial is so messed up that all the names are wrong and changed just to confuse us. That doesn't mean every time money is given to a business, it's a business investment and not usury. What's that key again? Risk. What do our financiers say to businesses? Here's some capital, here's some money. If you make a ton of money, I get a lot of it. If you fail and go into bankruptcy, I get all my money plus my profit too. That's not a business investment. They share zero risk, none. They say, I get a right to pursue you and every asset to get my money and the profit when there was no profit back. They get to claim in bankruptcy a right to profit. So it doesn't mean everything in our system that appears a business investment is. Many times it is just a usurious loan. But if it is a real business investment, you pool your money with your friend and start a business, he's going to do the work, you're supplying some of the tools, the capital to buy the tools, you can share profits, again, in a fair manner, in some way that is fair. So, two important distinctions. And the church is usually attacked by arguing against a straw man. The church is against business. Business partnerships, wrong. The church is against usurious lending. Now, what have been the consequences of allowing this in civil society and convincing people wrongly that it's not injustice? It's been what I talked to you about before, the draining of wealth away to the dictators of the proletariat, away from people. So if you think about it, Catholic doctrine has never said people should be equal in wealth. In fact, it said the opposite. We're all different. People will have more, some people will have less. Our Lord said the poor you always have with you. So church does not say everybody's supposed to have an equal amount of wealth. What she does say is you should only get your wealth through legitimate and just means, not through stealing, not through cheating people. But what does usury do? It changes the wealth position of people. It extracts wealth from those who don't have it and gives it and concentrates it in the wealthy. Why? Because I have one bottle of wine, I lend it to you, and now I have 3. You have lost 2. Keep transferring wealth further and further up. And this was seen by Pope Innocent IV 800 years ago in his commentary on canon law, when he said the effects of usury results in individual and societal decline of wealth. Borrowers at usury transfer a portion of their future wealth to the usurer. The society suffers as usury diverts investment away from business. Actually, the Catholic teaching is in favor of business investment. Stop lending to make a profit when you don't actually create any wealth and put it into business, such as farming. What's happened to our economy when it's built on usury? We don't grow anything, we don't build anything, we don't produce anything. We just lend money to people at usury so that they can buy things from China. That's what Pope Innocent IV foresaw would happen in an economy based on usury. They do not invest, they invest their money in usurious lending instead, where the money is put to non-productive uses. Defenders of the usurers suggest the really needy poor and those who need money for a short time due to a temporary emergency, such as illness, etc., benefit from usury. That's the argument. You still hear it today. Oh, but the poor otherwise wouldn't have any way to pay for their doctor bills without 50% in 6-month credit card rates. Well, Pope Innocent immediately says this is not true. Relying on St. Bernardine of Siena, he explains how no poor person needs usury and is not helped by usury, since it only makes the needier worse off. So he needed $100 to pay the doctor, but now he has to pay you $300. What he needed was a doctor, not a debt of a $200 additional dollars. The first group, those who can't have no other way of helping themselves, need what the church used to be able to provide in a Christian social order, institutionalized charity through the church, which was destroyed in the Reformation, another story by Henry VIII. That's what they need. They don't need someone charging them 300 times what they need and transferring their future wealth, if they really do need it. The payment of usury only exacerbates the poor's situation. And again, this understanding of Pope Innocent has been confirmed by what's been happening in our modern economy built on usury. Nearly 900 years after the arguments of Innocent IV and Bernardine of Siena, truth is demonstrated by the results of our practically unbridled consumer credit industry. An example of Pam Swanson, who needed $300 for current consumption, is illustrious. She borrowed $300 from a payday lender, a lender who borrows against your anticipated future wages. In 6 months, she accrued $900 in finance charges, a euphemism for usury. She transferred $900 of her future wealth to be able to consume $300 today. Although hers is an extreme case, and it's actually not that extreme, the principle is the same, regardless of amount. The transaction involves a wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. The only difference is the extent of the amount transferred. Now, as I said, the situation is made even worse by our modern monetary system. And I can't explain to you all the workings of the Federal Reserve. Again, I have a whole chapter in the book about it. But in essence, listen to how bad the problem is. It's even worse than I've said when it comes to banks. Because if I have $100 and I lend it to you and I charge money, profit, that's bad. But here's what the banks do. They lend you money that doesn't exist. And then they charge you for it. So in terms of, remember the church said you can charge for a loss? Here's what they do. You say, I want to borrow $10,000. I say, okay. Here, I give you a thing that says, I, the bank, owe you $10,000. And that's now money that you can go spend. So you become a lender to the bank by borrowing from them. But then you have to pay them back whatever fees are on top of that of real money. Because what happens when you repay your loan? That money goes out of existence. It only exists in our monetary system during the period the bank is lending to you and charging you money. It's as if you came to me and said, I'd like to borrow your hammer to hammer some nails on my wall, hang a picture. I say, sure, I'm going to charge you $1 for doing it. And then I say, here's an imaginary hammer that doesn't exist, and then I charge you for it. That's what the banks do. They create the money to lend, it goes out of existence, but then they extract value from you. Now, how do they get away with this? The government gave them the power to do it. Said, you can do this. You can charge people for things you don't have. If you went out and opened a store and said, I'm going to sell you things that are non-existent, you would be put in jail. But put a sign out that says a bank, you're ready to go. You can do it. And that's what makes it so problematic and insidious in our modern, in the modern context. So much so that in the early 20th century, in the 20s and 30s, there was a Jesuit, back when Jesuits were Catholic, I guess, who was an economist trained at Harvard, and a theologian. And he studied the usury question to great extent. I quote him significantly in the book, Bernard Dempsey. And he said, the problem with the modern economy is usury has gone from an individual sin that we can detect, there it is, to institutionalized. So we can't find the usurer because it's everywhere. It's an entire banking system that generates money, the money we have. As the last speaker showed, it's not the dollars in your wallet. They're insignificant. They're less than 6% of the money that exists. That's just monopoly toys to the financiers. It's all this invisible fake money that they create. And they have a right to create it and then charge you for it. Charge you for what is one of the basic roles of government, to provide a medium of exchange. For centuries, that was the primary obligation of government, to protect weights and measures, so we have fair exchanges and don't get cheated. And part of that was to have a stable currency. Government outsourced it to private banks. And again, don't have time to talk about it. Dr. Paul alluded to it. The Federal Reserve is a for-profit bank. It is not the government. The federal government makes $600–700 billion a year out of the Federal Reserve. It is a private industry that's charging us to produce the medium of exchange. And that's what Dempsey saw. It's everywhere. We can't get rid of it, in the sense that it's in every dollar that's created is the injustice, sapping wealth to the dictators, the dictator of the communist dream. And that's how serious the problem is, that it's so widespread. And again, Father Dempsey saw this almost about 80 years ago. So to put matters to rest, the church, seeing this, has always taught this, has not changed. The last definitive statement on usury was by Pope Benedict XIV, the Vix, in a document called Vix Prevenit, which, and again, there's a lot of attacks on this document. They try to discredit it, but it was a clear repetition of the ordinary magisterium, what the church had always and everywhere taught. It was originally in a letter to the Italian episcopacy, which Benedict then later said he applied it to the entire church. So it was a universal teaching, notwithstanding that he first taught it to the Italian bishops. And here's what he says and defines. The nature of the sin called usury has its proper place and origin in a loan. The financial contract between consenting parties, notice that. Unlike what libertarians will tell you, the fact that you consented to it doesn't make it just. Between consenting parties demands by its very nature that one return to another only as much as he has received. The sin rests on the fact that sometimes the creditor desires more than he has given. Therefore, he contends some gain or profit is owed him beyond that which he loaned. But any gain which exceeds the amount he gave is illicit and usurious. We do not deny that at times, together with the loan contract, certain other titles, such as interest, which are not intrinsic to the loan, may run in parallel with it. So a right to be compensated for loss. From these, other titles, entirely just and legitimate reasons, arise to demand something different from usury. Nor is it demanded that it is very often possible for someone, by means of contracts differing from loans, i.e. business partnerships, to spend and invest money legitimately, to engage in legitimate trade and business, and from these types derive a just profit. So again, the church, with clear distinctions, defines the sin of usury and maintains the distinctions. The enemies either deny its teaching or distort and deny the distinctions so as to destroy the whole doctrine. In practice, as I said, modern complexities arose. So determining, well, what's a loss and what's a gain is very, very difficult. That's intentional. Why? The usurers want to cover up what they're doing. So if we make it hard to detect, it's hard to punish us. So the church recognized that, and it is true, was circumspect in the 19th century to issue detailed proclamations on what exactly constituted usury in the current economy, because it was so hidden. Again, the church does not want to condemn the just along with the unjust. That's, as a matter of prudence, is not fair to just say, well, we're just going to condemn everybody. And so she was very circumspect and said, okay, instead of issuing papal documents explaining this particular contract was usurious, she transferred it to the internal forum, to the confessional. Told her confessors, it's too fact-specific now. You need to get into more detail, applying the universal principles to these new, very difficult times. And I'd like to end by showing you, it's again where I started. Not only the church recognizes this truth. I'd like to quote from someone that is A, the furthest thing from a Catholic, B, someone I disagree with in many respects, but who had at least the honesty, a real liberal, intellectual honesty, to admit the church was right. John Maynard Keynes, not a Catholic at all. Here's what he had to say about the church's teaching on usury. In reevaluating the scholastic theory, he restated this principle. I was brought up to believe the attitude of the medieval church to the rate of interest was inherently absurd, and that the subtle discussions aimed at distinguishing the return on money in a business from the return to active investment were merely Jesuitical attempts to find a practical escape from a foolish theory. But I now read these discussions as an honest intellectual effort to keep separate what the classical economic theory has inextricably confused together, namely the rate of, and he uses the word interest, and here's the confusion, but what he really means is usury, the rate of usury and the marginal efficiency of capital. In the scholastic language, the distinction between a rate of charging on a loan and the marginal efficiency of capital was the difference between usury on a motimum, a loan, and a profit derived from a true business investment. Implicit in Keynes's observation is a recognition of a fundamental difference between capital investment and mere money. And again, what's happened? We've turned the American economy into a debt machine. All we do is lend money at profit to people, again, so they can buy goods from other countries. And what do people say? Oh, the church's theory will stop business investment. When it's the opposite. Since we've moved to a usurious economy based on usurious finance, we don't invest anything in factories anymore. Why build a factory when you can set up a Bank of America office and lend credit cards to people and make 10 times the money? Henry Somerville, again from the same period, also made this observation. Now, the canonists, the Catholic legal scholars, never quarreled with payments for the use of capital. They raised no objection to true profit, the reward of risk in a business, ability and enterprise. But they disputed the identification of the lending of money with the investment of capital and denied the justice of interest as a reward for saving without investment. The canonist principle was that sharing in trade risks made an investor a partner, a co-owner of capital, and not simply a mere money lender. And that is what gave title to a profit. Having removed this distinction of real business partnership for business purposes from the scope of usury analysis, which is the charging of a profit on a mere loan, this leaves the issue of true loans, money lent to buy consumable goods or services. The Catholic analysis of usury provides principles for evaluating our modern monetary system and such loans. First, this topic intersects with a broad area of public policy. How do we in society deal with the communist planned extraction of wealth away from society into the hands of a few? That's a problem we have to deal with because people's ability, the middle class's ability to survive is being destroyed by this plan of the usurers to institute a communist state of universal poverty. How do we deal with that? The answer isn't keep doing the problem, keep lending at usury. The answer is not to continue to make usurious loans to fund survival. The Catholic theory of usury demonstrates an underlying assumption that requiring people to borrow from profit-seeking lenders is not an appropriate solution to find necessary fund consumption. It violates commutative justice. It leads to effects not in harmony with distributive justice. Permitting such lending not only works individual injustice against the borrower, but makes the overall situation worse by redistributing what little wealth the poor and middle class have and their potential future wealth to those who have stored up money. Thus, any revitalization of usury laws to prohibit profit-seeking lending for consumption must be coupled with overall monetary and economic reform. And the answer to our problem is not just let them eat their loans. So, in conclusion, modern usury law is a chaotic mess of state and federal regulation. As concerns about the state of our national credit market grow daily, the debate over how best to regulate the extension of credit remains inconclusive. One surveying the literature over the past few decades is unlikely to find one article expressing complete satisfaction with the approach of existing legislation and policy. I have argued that Catholic doctrine, which framed the discussion of credit for over a millennium, should be readmitted to the debates over usury and loans. Simple rate capping, as was the temporary solution in the 19th century, is not the answer. Returns to the original approach of Catholic doctrine on usury would benefit the modern debates over credit regulation. Application of Catholic doctrine would preclude a uniform, consistent legal regime which drew no distinctions. the distinction between business investment and mere usurious lending. The former category would not be subject, meaning business investment, to usury law, but would be governed by general contractual and just principles of corporate law. Redesignating usury, redesigning usury law would regulate the second category to permit lenders to recover their true and fair costs, including operational costs, but not to profit. Beyond this cost recovery, usury law would prohibit the charging of a profit, except in the sense of a reimbursement for real lost profit. Rather than addressing the needs of those without the resources to obtain necessity by handing them over to the for-profit usurers, we need to address the real problems with our economic system. Formulating a detailed plan to this that would preclude such unjust profits in a world full of a fiat monetary system and an unholy collusion of government and central banking would certainly be complex and challenging, but it would offer the prospects of working towards a more principled, just order. Until this happens, hardworking Americans live with the de facto abdication of leadership, both from the church and the state, who remain completely silent about this. Which again, doesn't mean the church has changed their position. It just means that those in authority have decided to give themselves over to the system and let the Vatican Bank participate in this and just stop talking about it. Yet the principles remain. Reestablishing the principles of usury doctrine as the foundation of our legal, economic, and monetary system will not be easy. The Roman praetor, Acilio, began permitting debtors to raise in court the original Roman law prohibition of usury, which in practice had fallen into disuse. So it was still on the law, it was illegal to charge usury, but they just let them do it anyway. So this Roman praetor says, hey, we're going to start enforcing the law. What was the consequence of his attempts to do this? The moneylenders killed Acilio in the Roman Forum in broad daylight. Although killed in broad daylight, notwithstanding the reward offered and immunity to all of the hundreds of witnesses by the Senate, nobody came forward with any evidence or testimony. According to Appian, the moneylenders covered up everything. Even if the work of resurrecting ancient principles of justice and practical rules of law would be complex and probably dangerous and would take decades to complete, a great work can be done by at least preserving these principles. As Hilaire Belloc noted more than 3/4 of a century ago, it should be pointed out that there is all the difference in the world between a system in which what is an immoral principle is admitted and one in which, though the immorality is practiced, the principle is denied and refused. There is, and presumably always will be, plenty of adultery, murder, swindling, and the rest present in society. But the society in which the rights of property are admitted, and in which marriage is sacred, and in which the taking of human life is abhorrent, is very different from one when the sexes are promiscuous, where communism prevails, or where killing for private revenge, or what is considered acceptable. There is all the difference in the world between a society in which such lapses continue de facto and are even tolerated to an extent, and one in which they are called good. The cynical side of me says we are likely to have to wait clearly until the triumph of the Immaculate Heart for our society to be reorganized on such a basis. Yet God does not want us to simply sit by and wait, even if it is true that only she can end this era of injustice. She is the only one that can help us. She wants us to do our part by being informed, being aware, and prepare for the supernatural intervention when it comes. The least we can do is keep Catholic truth alive. Thank you for your attention.